Now, debt. We talk about debt all the time. Kenya, of course, is between 10 to 11 trillion. The reason why you can't say about debt with certainty, now in the markets, exchange rates is changing. So the debt in the morning is different from the debt in the evening. So it's around 10 to 11 trillion. The only thing I want to isolate there, because I was talking about debt, why can't we borrow? Because all the other growing economies borrow anyway. And we have empirical evidence to show that the US debt to GDP ratio is over 120%. That Japan is over 260%. And Kenya is below 70%. And especially by using the nominal GDP of 18 trillion. Why can't we borrow? Then why can't we as economists then come up with a theory in a paper, those who are doing masters? Borrowing as a tool for economic growth. Why can't one of us then come up with that kind of a paper? And I'm giving my opinions. I am not an authority per se. These are my opinions. Japan. You know, unless the policy maker wants to borrow, they say big economies are borrowing. And they cite the US, the UK, and of course Japan comes in handy to justify. But we have refused to go that route. Why? Currently the US debt is over 32 trillion Kenya shillings, the US debt. But then in borrowing, number one, you look at the use. When you borrow, this money is going into doing what? Because if you are borrowing and the money cannot generate more money within the economy, then stop borrowing. And that's what we are precisely doing. Number two, you look at interest rate. Our domestic debt as a composition of the entire debt and the external debt is 50-50. So when you talk about 10 trillion debt, 5 trillion is domestic and 5 trillion, give or take, is foreign. Out of that, our major debt, which is foreign, is dollar denominated. So when you have a variation in currency, which you may not have a lot of control when you are in a floating exchange rate regime, then you are trying to borrow and jump into a hole where you don't know it is up to what depth. So that's one of the reasons why we cannot continue perpetuating over borrowing. Because we don't have a lot of control over the gymnastics around exchange rate. Second, and maybe the last, because the rest you know, Japan. If you study the economy of Japan, since 1994, for 30 years, the GDP of Japan, in real terms, economics, you know you have real and nominal. If you deflate the Japanese economy, it has not grown in real terms for 30 years. But then, why am I saying that? How is it related? Japan has a 260% debt to GDP ratio. But why can't we compare ourselves with Japan? The major thing is this. Two, cost. Number one is cost. Number two is something I'll call net off. Cost. Do you know Japanese government does business with borrowing? Do you know part of how Japanese government raises money is the business that I'm talking about of debt? If you check, you can Google later. Before COVID, there is a time you could buy a 10-year bond, a Japanese 10-year bond at negative interest rate. Can you imagine? In Kenya now, we are talking about infrastructure bond of 18%. Japan, negative. That's one, cost. Second, net off. Can you do for me empirically how many countries Kenya has lent money? Kenya is a debtor, but is it a creditor? Or the other way around? Just tell me, because you are economists, how many countries has Kenya lent money? Anyone with an idea? Maybe silence means if you don't know. Look at Japan. When we are talking about the US having 32 trillion Kenya shillings in public debt, The number one external lender of the US government is Japan. But at what rate? Now you try to see how much have they borrowed at, how much have they given the US at. That's the reason why comparing a thriving, growing economy to those in terms of borrowing, you only do it when you are lazy. So when you see me on TV one day justifying we are borrowing because Japan is borrowing, no, these guys have started to be lazy. Because there is no comparison. Let me come to the close by the last point. As we think now as economists, I'm just provoking ourselves. We have read many theories in economics. Mercantilist, we know them. That trading alone makes a lot of sense in economic growth. We have read about physiocrats. Physiocrats, they say, no. Agriculture is the main thing in economic growth. That the only productive sector in an economy is agriculture. Because the others, you only transform the factors. But then, why must we focus on as economists? This is my opinion. Looking at the US, the UK, the Asian tigers, one thing that we must continually improve in Kenya, in Africa, in all developing countries is capital accumulation. If you look at Kenya, how much capital is allocated to every Kenyan who is a worker? Look at Japan, for example. Look at Germany. Germany, you see capital per worker per person reached optimum many years ago. So the most they can do is to maintain, because there is no more growth to do in terms of capital per worker. If you look at all those economies, including China, when you talk about China in manufacturing, we are basically talking about accumulation of capital. Because the major component of manufacturing is capital itself. Because then you look at Kenya, for example. The reason why we are agrarian now is because our number one priority is not even to create quality jobs. Number one priority is to engage everyone. Because there are so many people without jobs. So when you're a policy maker, number one thing that you're doing is first of all to know, how do I engage as many Kenyans as possible? So the question of how am I engaging Kenyans becomes secondary. And I think then, as policymakers, we need to move in tandem. Because what would we rather have? Labor-intensive industries where everyone is employed with very low productivity, or then we have a sizable number of people unemployed, but those people who are working are optimally utilized. I don't need an answer. I'm just provoking our mind. The other thing, just a few things about what we are doing in government as I close. Poleni, nimechanganya vitu mingi because the topic is too wide. People are saying, no. You people, KICC and all the other parastatals. Privatization, that's the one I'm talking about. I don't want to be explicit because I see cameras here. And I don't want to be misquoted. Now, as an economist, you are seated here. What is the role of government? From where I sit, if the government guarantees me security, guarantees me property rights, guarantees me enforcement of my rights, and gives me a conducive environment, my opinion, it should leave me alone from there. Because the interactions between private sector, between economic agents, make much more sense than the government offering services. Now, Kenya has over 300 institutions. Some are commercial in nature. When government comes in, you know, when we are in economic classes, we say one of the reasons for market failure is public goods. How is banking a public good? That the government of Kenya owns a bank. How many people here, I can say it because it's public, how many people have an account in Consolidated Bank of Kenya? Do you know? Now, let me also say this. How many of you who your grandmother has ever boarded a plane? I'm not even asking about, of course, many of us flew here. Now, do you know why I'm asking that? The tax my grandmother pays in the village as VAT. Can you imagine? At over 40 billion of that in a year goes into building KQ. My grandmother pays rent, pays tax as VAT in even salt, so to say. It bills you to come to Mombasa through KQ. So what am I asking? Why is the government engaging in areas where private sector is already doing so well? And in sectors that are already so profitable, you find government institutions doing so badly. Look at banking sector in Kenya. It has been growing every year. Look at the government institutions within that banking sector. Look at how they perform. And you can't cite KCB because KCB is very different. It is run as a private sector. So all these things we are doing because government to be efficient must be lean. And the reason why we want to dispose of all these things by way of either leasing, some even selling through IPOs, and others, of course, through other methods, is because we cannot continue now talking about the budget I read here to you, and the deficit you are taking, borrowing, is coming to bail out a company that is not strategic in nature in terms of governance. And that is the reason why we are doing what we are doing. Very lastly, this is not economic, but maybe it's Turkish, not economists. Kenya, we are here as Kenyans now. What do we do mostly? You get a tender, you get employed, immediately here, all of us have plots. All. If you don't have, you already have a lot of buying a plot. I am sure. You know why I'm very excited about housing program that the president is leading?